Hey. Thank you so much for sticking around for this Talkback. I'm so delighted to introduce everybody to Dr. Carla Boutin-Foster, who is so many things. She is a wife and a mother, she's a primary care physician, and she's also a deacon at the Emmanuel Baptist Church, and has just been doing some extraordinary research in her work. So, Dr. Carla Boutin-Foster, everybody. So this is your first time seeing the show?
Yes.
And what's resonating with you right now?
It's incredible. And, I really thank Eve for sharing her story. Mm-hmm. As a physician, one of the things that was most challenging, it's caring. Mm-hmm. If you don't care, it's easy. It's easy. It's very almost algorithmic, what you're supposed to do. We go to medical school, but when you care about someone and you're able to see the person behind the patient, right? And for physicians, that's scary, right? Oh my goodness, there's a person, right? Because if it's just a patient, you can stick, you can prod, you can pull, you can walk into the room and they're half naked, right? I remember one of the first things that, as a resident, I was taught when I was doing a pap smear. So I went ahead and I did this pap smear, and I said, okay, so I have the speculum, wide open, right? How many people have had pap smears or know what pap smears are like, right? And I walk in, and I said, wow, I'm gonna do a pap smear, it's gonna be so cool. And I go in, and I said, oh, it's not quite right. So this person had her legs wide open, the speculum was there, and I said, I don't quite see that little thing that's supposed to feel like the nose, and they called it a cervix. I'm going to leave you legs wide open, speculum in, and I'm gonna go out and get my supervising attending. So I walk in, I'm like, I think I found that little thing that feels like a nose. She yelled at me. She pulled me aside, took the speculum out, told the patient to sit up. She said, how would you like if you sat there open and she used a very colorful word, but vagina was wide open for the world to come in. What if this woman had to use the bathroom? What if someone walked in? Is this the way you would want for someone to see you? And I said, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. And we forget that we're taking care of people, of mothers, of sisters. So when she said the doctor looked at her and said, I know of your work. I know who you are. I know of the person behind the patient. That resonated with me.
Oh, so beautiful. And I mean, in the work that you've been doing, how do you think people can find those pathways to openness and to caring?
Coming to see this, I'm thinking, I'm like, wow, who can I get to pay to bring all of my students here? Speaking to people, really. Speaking to people to find out, who are they? Tell me a little bit about yourself. One of the things that's most challenging for a physician to do, especially a physician in training, is to take what's called the social history. Because that's when you really get to know the person. Tell me a little bit more about yourself. Where do you work? Where are you from? How long have you been here? Tell me about your family. Right? Are you married? Are you seeing anyone? Male or female or both? Tell me about your sexual relationships, And that's where like, whoa, oh my goodness, how do you, and that's where we at least the students that I have an opportunity to teach, they get like that's not in the book, you can't check that off, like it just doesn't make sense. And I think when we realize that the doctor-provider relationship is a sacred bond. It's a privilege. I tell my students that all the time. It's a privilege. It's a conversation. And the more conversational it can be, the easier it is for you and your person who's a patient. Because if we're nervous asking about the sexual history, if we're like, you're not doing that, are you? Like, no. You don't smoke, do you? No. You don't use drugs, do you? No. And that's unfortunately how it can come across. So I think appreciating that there is a person, and it's not, humility. I've realized that I've made mistakes. I've realized that those mistakes happen when I'm nervous or rushed, and I forget that person, and I can think back, and I'm ashamed of some of the interactions I may have had because I forgot that person, and I was too busy focused about me. Eve writes in her book that there was the surgeon who was off to have dinner. The doctor who was reconstructing the bag when she had the cyst, and it sounded like this person was off to dinner. You know, and when you're rushed and you forget this person, you know, that's when the error, miscommunication happens. So always seeing that person.
It's so interesting because I wonder where along the way people forget how to have that kind of interaction where that's not the default necessarily.
I think, you know, again, when there's pressure, when someone is rushed, at times it may be just your own insecurity as a provider. You know, this person reminds me, of my own mortality, and this defense mechanism. You know, as long as I stay the doctor and this is a patient, then that wall is there. But you know, medical education is improving. We're spending a lot of time on understanding the provider-patient communication, more so than when I was in medical school 20 years ago. We spend a lot of time. In fact, a student can do exceptionally well on all of their what's called medical knowledge, but if they don't do well with that provider-patient interaction, some students may have to remediate, and this is across all schools. As a matter of fact, so you have to take these licensing exams, step 1 and step 2. Step 2 now has a doctor-patient interaction. So you cannot be a licensed physician unless you sufficiently demonstrated that you can take an interview, a complete interview. That means the social history as well. And if you're not able to demonstrate that, then that will delay your ability to graduate from medical school. So we're really appreciating that. As providers, we have to be compassionate and caring and attentive to the person behind the patient.
It's so funny. There was someone who came in and did a talkback a couple of weeks ago. Her name's Lottie Pogrebin, and she wrote a book. She herself. Do you guys know? Her? Yeah. She's really incredible, and she wrote a really beautiful book. I'm trying to remember the exact title of it, but it's something like how to be a friend or how to connect. Does anybody remember the title of that book? But basically, like how to reconnect as a person with your friends when they're getting ill, and it's basically just reconnecting to like basic things and having an understanding of just what your friend might need or not need as they're going through their treatment, etc. Yeah. I actually want to ask you about one amazing, you're doing so many extraordinary things. You received $8 million in funding for a 5-year, I have to read it because it's so incredible, $8 million in funding for a 5-year period from the National Center on Minority Health and Health Disparities, which is a division of the National Institutes of Health. Can you talk a little bit about what that research was?
Oh, sure. So, the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, funds research. And one of their centers is the National Institute for Minority Health Disparities. So if you look at chronic conditions, you'll see there are certain populations that are at higher risk, for instance, hypertension. So one of the things that, with this funding that we were able to do was to reach out to individuals who have elevated hypertension and who are at greatest risk for poor outcomes. And in our community, it's African Americans with the highest risk of hypertension and the higher risk of poor outcomes, stroke, cardiac disease, end-stage renal disease. But yet, there may be some members in the community who do not have access to care. So one of the things that, and this wasn't only me, this was my colleague, Joseph Ravenel and Benga Ogedegbe from NYU, they realized, especially for African American men, or sometimes men in general, it may be harder for men to go to the provider. So Joe Ravenel, he actually has a TED Talk on this, realized that, hey, when he goes to the barber, there are people who are talking about things in health, and he came up with this idea of why don't we go and try to talk about hypertension in the barbershop setting. And so that's what he did. So we did these studies where he actually, in the grant that I was a PI of paid for it, was able to go into the barbershops and reach out to people and reach out to men, meet them where they are. That was one of the things. And realize that as a barber, you're meeting your clients, and if we teach you how to educate others about high blood pressure, then you can be effective. And it was. And the other thing that he did was to colon cancer prevention, that there may be lower rates of screening. So he said, well, maybe they can also talk about screening and colorectal cancer, and to talk about it in a way, again, it's just two people talking, like, getting your hair cut. So that was one study, and the other study was that we called motivational interviewing. It's Triumph. It's the trial to improve outcomes in minorities with hypertension, and it used motivational interviewing. So motivational interviewing is a non-confrontational conversation that you have with clients. It's client-centered, that you try to get them to understand why they may want to change, and what are their goals, and what are the current behaviors that they're engaged in that may be counterproductive to achieving that goal. And at the end, you're hoping to come together to arrive at the patient makes the decision that it is important to change and what they will do. So in essence, it's empowering people by giving them information and helping them to set realistic goals. So those were the studies we were able to do.
So incredible. And it sounds like, a lot of the work too is then also just reframing a lot of things about how people think about things.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you say that. So one of the approaches that we use besides motivational interviewing is called self-affirmation. So Claude Steele is a psychologist who came up with the idea of self-affirmation, which basically says that in order for health behavior or any type of behavior to occur, one must first feel that they're okay. And when you think about it, as providers, when we tell someone to change their behavior, whether it's to eat a healthier diet, to stop smoking, it's in essence saying something is not correct with what's happening now, so change. And I have teenagers, and I will ask them to change the sheets, their socks, and they'll say no, just because. No, I'm not going to do it. Why? You're telling me to change. Why am I change your underwear? No, why? Right? So Dr. Steele realized that in order for people to be okay with changing, they have to be okay with themselves. So perhaps by reaffirming one's value, what makes you you? Like, for instance, when the doctor said to Eve, I'm aware of the work that you do, right? Again, that's affirming who they are. And then you can say, okay, I see that this is important to you. Well, let's talk about your blood pressure now. So it's putting in the context of who that individual is, validating them, recognizing that this is a person. Again, it goes back to meeting people where they are and reframing, as opposed to, if you don't do this, this is going to happen. But from your perspective, what's important to you, and why would this behavior be important? So it is reframing the way we approach people.
And what are some things that have been surprising to you in the research? I'm sure you go in and you have a certain expectation of what the outcome is going to be.
That, some of our participants who were less likely to modify their behavior, it had to do with stress. So something would happen, someone would lose their job, someone would have to move, there would be a death in the family, there would be a violent altercation between that individual and someone else in their family, and then behavior changes stop. So as physicians, we have to realize that in the process or in the context of helping patients to adopt healthier behavior, life still goes on. Life goes on, right? So someone can be on the road to giving up cigarettes. They set a quit date, they have their patch, they have all of their medication, and they're ready to give up, and then something happens. And as physicians, we have to realize it's not that this person all of a sudden does not want to engage in healthier behaviors, or they're a bad person or a bad patient. Life happens, life happens, and then we have to learn, okay, let's redirect, let's work together. Let's go back to a time when you were successful. That's what self-affirmation does also. Let's think back to a time when you were able to stop smoking for 6 weeks. Yeah. Okay, so can we try 8 weeks now? As opposed to, wow, I can't believe you've only stopped for 4 weeks and you started again. So it's reaffirming, readdressing, rethinking the way we communicate with people. And it goes back to seeing that patient, the person behind the patient. And it's something that we strive to do as medical educators, especially for the younger physicians, to make sure that this is the person that you're taking care of. And of course, to approach all of your people with evidence-based medicine. That's the first thing. You have to know the facts. You have to be able to do the research and understand what the evidence is. But at the same time, communicating with that individual, meeting them where you are, because we can create all of the solutions, all of the genetic technology that we have. But if you're not able to communicate with someone and understand why they may or may not want to have chemo. You know, and you say, oh, you know, I'm just gonna check that off. Because, you know, like, as I said in the beginning, when you don't care, like, oh, I offered her this, she said no, I'm walking away, you know, job done, that's it. You know, told her to stop smoking, she doesn't want to do it. But if you're, as a caring physician, it's understanding why. Not necessarily to change the patient's mind. And I think that's what gets, that can often be frustrated. Like, I tried, and you're still doing this. As a doctor, you're there to provide information and to work with the patient. If the patient makes a decision that perhaps is counterintuitive to what you would expect, okay, let's work together. So it's communication.
It seems like finding ways to just embrace people's humanity and find ways to empower them by meeting them exactly where they are. It's, you know, one of the other really interesting things that you've been working on, I know you just with SUNY and doing a lot of work about diversity and inclusion within the medical and biomedical fields. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that has been going.
All right, that's really incredible. I have the opportunity to meet with just wonderful students.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we want to do in medicine as a whole is increase diversity in medicine. As the population becomes increasingly diverse, the healthcare workforce is not keeping pace. So you have close to, in 2050, probably more than 50% of the population will be non-white, African American, Asian American. But currently, the number of physicians, it's, you know, in medical school, for instance, about less than 20% are racial ethnic minority medical students. That's Black, Latino, Asian American, Native American. So we want to make sure that as the population becomes increasingly diverse, that the medical workforce keeps pace. We've done very well with women. You know, women are close to half of the medical workforce. However, the challenge is that women are still not at the same levels, hierarchies. You know, so there are very few academic women deans. There are very few. If you look at the ranking, and it's usually instructor, assistant, associate, and full professors. There are very few women who are full professors, yet about 40 to 50% of women are medical students, but when it comes to the professorship, it's like 20 to 30%. So that's what my work is about. It's really creating an environment in our medical school that everyone can come and feel that they're part of the team. It also means looking at our curriculum, making sure that we're addressing disparities. We're looking at gender health. We're looking at LGBT health, that we're engaging in dialogues. So it's inclusion beyond race and ethnicity. So for us, diversity is race, ethnicity, orientation, gender, religious beliefs or not, experiences, abilities, life experiences. So our office is called Diversity, Education, and Research, and we focus on inclusion because I personally believe that we will achieve more diversity by being inclusive and recognizing that we're all working, and injustice for one is injustice for all. So we're working we're working with our Black and Latino students, our LGBT students, our Pride Club, and to celebrate diversity, to celebrate that we all have differences, but there's so many similarities when you think about it. Right? When you think about it, there's so many similarities. And you know, I have to be honest, when I sat here, I looked around, I was like, okay, not many people look like me in the audience. Very like, talk about diversity, right? And yet, we were all able to share in her story. Right? Isn't that what humanity is? Right? So as one of probably the only African American woman, there's probably someone else in the audience, right? You know, at first, seriously, I got here. So Marcia Pendleton, she and I go to church again. I was like, oh, I gotta talk to Marcia when I leave here. But you know, but as soon as she started to share her story, you know, it resonated with all of us, whether it was as providers, as mothers, as a daughter, as a sister, as a friend, as the social worker, as the advocate. There was a part of her that spoke to each and every one of us. And that's what diversity is. It's being able to come together and to share in a story, to contribute to something and make it greater, right? Yeah. So that's what my work does. It's not about creating divisions or separations or silos, but it's bringing people together, you know, bringing differences together, right, and effecting real change, because that's what makes this country great, that we don't have to be the same, and that's what, in my work as a diversity officer, that's what I do. You know, I look for the students with who've overcome adversity, the resilient ones, the ones who escaped, war, the ones who were refugees, the ones who, for religious reasons, were not able to go to school. And again, it goes beyond race and ethnicity. It's experiences. It's the human experience that makes all of us great.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting. I mean, I'm sure you guys have had many conversations about also just the differences between the word diversity and inclusion, because I think a lot of people, when they think diversity, think of like a person of color or a woman or someone who's a member of the LGBT community, rather than thinking of it as the diversity meaning inclusive of everybody. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit just about the notions of diversity and inclusion and the work you've had to do to kind of help people understand what the difference between those two things is.
Right. No, that's a great point. So oftentimes when someone thinks of diversity, it's focused on gender, race, or ethnicity. Mm-hmm. And what the word inclusion does, it creates an environment where everyone can come and participate, right? So everyone can come to the dance and dance freely. I once there was a physician at Cornell who once said that. So inclusion is being able to, like, diversity. You're all invited to the dance, but you can't dance that way, But inclusion is when everyone is invited, everyone comes, and they're doing whatever they want to do. Like when Eve said, "Get up and do whatever." People are doing the robot, the Running Man, whatever it is that you want to do, the tango, and you feel okay. And everyone is celebrating it. That's inclusion, right? That's inclusion where everyone, where if you were to stop and you're like, oh, wait a minute, everyone's dancing, and I can't really tell the difference between, so that's inclusion. And I think, again, we can achieve greater diversity through inclusion and increasing the different experiences and voices that come together, especially in this world. When you think about it, in social science, there's this concept of intersectionality. So, are you African American? Are you African American and gay? Are you African American from the Caribbean? Are you African American and you spent your entire life in London? What does that mean? What does that mean? And rather than creating silos where, like, well, you're this, therefore you're black, so you don't understand the gay experience, and you're gay, and therefore you don't understand the Caribbean experience, or you're black, but you're not from the Caribbean, so are you really? So we create so many separations and divisions where if we would allow people to bring who they are and to celebrate that, and to be proud, to be proud of who you are, but to be willing to listen to someone else's perspective and together, create solutions. A lot of the work that I do is community engagement. And listening to the voices of the community to address solutions, because that's where the solutions lie. It's the community, that's why we're doing this work. And Eve, as you saw Eve, her journey, it was reconnecting with the city of joy, and that was what strengthened her. It's reaching out to the community. So the reason that I love working with community partners, faith-based organizations, because it gives me a sense of purpose. It gives me a sense of purpose of why am I doing this? Why am I doing this?
It sounds like in the work that you're doing in terms of community engagement and teaching and also in your own practice is also, I'm trying to figure out the path to the question. It's figuring out how to just reconnect everybody to their own, to collective humanity, but also it sounds like what sounds exciting about it is that you're able to constantly reevaluate what the tools of that engagement are and really engage with the students and engage with the community to figure out how to move forward. It's not imposing anything on anybody.
Yeah. It's really working together. It's in social science research, we call it like stakeholder informed or community engagement or participatory research, that you can't create programs without involving the people who you believe will benefit from it in the development of programs. So it's really collective voices, a collective impact of everyone coming together to look at what are the assets, what are the solutions, and from that perspective to try to address the problems, because otherwise we can approach it from a problem-based as opposed to an asset-based approach. An asset-based recognizing this is the community, this is a diverse community, and the community has different resources, whether it's the schools or the stores or the grandma who looks out her window and she sees everything that's happening on the corner, right? And if you're trying to create a crime prevention on your community and you know, speaking with the police officers, speaking to grandma in room, you know, in you know, 3G, and she's always looking out her window and she knows what's going on. And that's recognizing these are the assets that we can bring together collectively to address the problem.
It's beautiful. I want to open up for some questions. If anybody has a question in the house. Yes.
Yes, I'm wondering if that has to start early, even as children. My husband was in a wheelchair and he was in there for almost 36 years, a spinal cord injury. And even children, you talk about adults, and one Thanksgiving they had a little turkey, and the teacher said, "Oh, if your parents are home." So I'm very happy you were. I said, "Okay, then we go." And when he rolled into that class, the class went silent. And this is second graders. So my question is, how do you have to start early? Is there a program to maybe somehow include more kids in school or books or something? And the parents, when he would be sitting, and little boys, they'd start like pushing because they see the wheels, and the mothers would be like, "God, really, can you try to say something?" You know, but it's like we instill that, and I think there has to be an awareness. I don't know if you could work on something like that, or it starts young.
And she just has a question in terms of how to include people in this conversation from a younger age, and is just telling a story about her husband who has a spinal cord injury and who has been in a wheelchair, and just kind of different experiences of young people's exposure.
No, I think that's an excellent idea, that it does have to start from a young age, and that young children have to appreciate the diversity and differences in ability, that people have different abilities and different presentations, and again, to embrace that. So you're absolutely right. We're doing some work. Actually, we're having a conference in March on disparities that exist among people with different levels of abilities. And one of the things that we did, which was really, I mean, it was almost embarrassing. So we invited an advocate, a very strong advocate of women's health and advocating for the rights of women with physical limitations. And when she came to speak about, to just basically to brainstorm on what we were going to talk about, she said, "You know what? I can't invite my community partners here because we will not be able to use the bathroom, because the bathroom was not accessible to the level, the size of the wheelchair that she had." And we're looking at each other like, "Oh my goodness, this is really embarrassing." And again, that's where inclusion comes in, right? If we were to have, a lot of times there are discussions that occur about people and they're not in the room, right? There are discussions about women's health that happen and women are not in the room. So if we had these discussions without this advocate in the room, we never would have known, we never would have been able to come together and say, okay, we need to fix this. So that's where inclusion comes in, really, including everyone at the table, you know, to have a discussion. So I think you're absolutely right. This is something that starts from a young age, where people can learn from a very young age that we all have different levels of ability and have different experiences.
Yes.
I thought that the scene in the play you described where the doctor walked around and said, to me what resonated was that it felt like a shift in the power balance. And that's something that I've always struggled with, and I would imagine that for disadvantaged communities or people of color in a very white, medical environment, that balance of power is more difficult to deal with. And deal with medical professions.
No, and I'll just repeat the question in case anybody didn't hear it. She just has a question about power balance, specifically citing the moment in the play where the doctor says, I know, I recognize who you are, and the question is really about how are we dealing with the power balance in the medical community?
That's another great question. One of the things that I always tell the students is when you're speaking with a patient, a person, is to sit at their level. So looking down is not good, but to sit with someone, not like this with your arms crossed, but let's talk. Tell me about yourself. Because you have a lot of people who come to you with life experiences that you don't know about as a physician. Tell me more about that. So just this genuine desire to know more about that person, and again, helps to break barriers, because at the end of the day, while there is this imbalance, this inherent imbalance between your providers and your patients, but at the end of the day, we're human, and it's the human experience. Tell me more about that. So, as I was saying before, so when the students take the exam, we teach them, open-ended questions, not tell me about this, yes, no. If a student doesn't say, tell me more about that, they may have to repeat that session. So we're very serious. And tell me more about that, not like, all right, tell me more about that, but really, you know, like genuinely, tell me more about that. Because you do have to address that power imbalance, whether it's gender or based on religious practices or race or ethnicity, to make the person feel comfortable that you're there for them, you're there to support them, that you will be their advocate. And that helps to break down the silos and sort of to narrow the gap.
I think we've got time for one more.
Could you tell us if and how being a deacon informs your being a physician?
Did you ask me that?
Wow, he just has a question about how being a deacon informs being a physician.
Service. It's the opportunity to serve others, and as a physician, what's most rewarding to me is serving. It's whether it's seeing patients when I had a practice. Now that I'm an associate dean, it's being a service to my students who can come in and ask a question if something's not going right. It's being of service, is helping people to feel empowered, helping people to feel good about themselves, and helping them to navigate the system. As a deacon, one of the things that we have the privilege of doing is called intercessory prayer. So people will come to us and share their prayers, and we pray with them. You know, it's not anything magical. I don't think that there's a hotline between me and, you know, God. It's sharing, bearing each other's burdens, and together we can pray. So it's the same thing. You know, that's what helps me to be I hope a better physician and teacher, is this privilege, and as human beings that we're called to serve each other. And as a physician, this is a privilege to serve. So it's the service. It's the service.
We'll take one more before we run. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. For so many years, women have been second-class citizens in medicine. One part of that has changed significantly in that we've gotten so many women into medical school now in very robust numbers. As you pointed out, there I think actually more than 50% now as medical students and upcoming physicians. How do you feel, though, about one part that I haven't seen change, and that is women as research subjects? Because we assume that women's bodies are the same as men. That held us back in the cardiac field for many, many years. Has any of that improved?
So she just has a question about the role and history of women in medicine and medical science, and in terms of researching how that has changed or is growing.
Another excellent question. So that has changed. So you asked about women as research participants. So now the National Institutes of Health, probably in their early 90s, had a policy that if you're doing a research study, that you cannot exclude women just because they're women, or you can't exclude a woman because you think she's going to become pregnant, because that was easy to do. Well, maybe she'll become pregnant one day, so therefore we cannot include her or even talk to her about this research trial. So you cannot do that. You have to have a compelling reason, scientific-based reason, that you are not including women, like prostate cancer. That's about the, no really. Anything else, you have to give me a reason for not including women. I mean, there are studies, like if you're doing a study on fatherhood, or, those are obvious. So the NIH and other funding agencies have set that policy. There are also programs that address the need to increase the number of women who are doing research studies, so that we can address other factors. You know, again, that goes back to diversity and inclusion, that if everyone at the table, if all the researchers look the same, then the research studies will be the same. So in order for us to engage more women in clinical trials, then the clinical trials have to understand what are some of the unique psychosocial factors that will impact a woman's outcome. For instance, we know with coronary artery disease that the signs and symptoms are not the same. They may not necessarily be chest pain. It may be nausea. It may be fatigue, right? So it may go unnoticed. And women may be more diagnosed with something that's more psychosomatic or hysteria than a true heart attack. So we need more diverse women coming to the table who may have had social network experiences, right? You know what you experience. You know, well, no, you know, we really need to expand that symptom and include, not only we're including people who've had chest pain, but what about fatigue and nausea and abdominal pain and someone with high risk? So for twofold, the NIH makes it virtually impossible not to include women in your study. We're increasing the number of women who are trained to do research so that we can ask more comprehensive questions and looking at what's called sex as a biological variable to understand, you know, the response to treatment may be different, you know, based on one's sex, right? So we are doing things to increase the participation of women in clinical trials and also the participation of women who can develop research questions that address the needs of all individuals, but also, you know, pay attention to the needs of women. So that's.
Thank you.
I just want to let everybody know these Beyond the Stage talkbacks, they're sponsored by Jan Warner in memory of her husband, Arthur Warner. And if you go to the MTC website, you'll see that there's a number, I think there's maybe like 4 or 5 conversations left. Even if you're not coming to the show that day, you're welcome to join us after the show for any of those conversations. And also, I'll just encourage you all to visit the City of Joy website. And there's also a documentary about City of Joy coming out that you can kind of follow along if you go to the website as well. I just want to say a huge thank you to Dr. Carla Boutin-Foster for joining us.